down to Falmouth, so it's kind of nice in that way that we're able to offer Zoom presentations and remote presentations and get to interact with people we normally wouldn't. So thank you all for taking the time to participate today. So my background, I am a very passionate birder. So I'm always very excited to have the opportunity to share that passion with people. And today we're going to be talking about some of my favorite birds. So today we're focusing on birds on the beach. And on the Cape, pretty much any bird that exists here, you can see on the beach at some point. So that opens up a lot of possibilities, but I'll be focusing on two groups today, which are shorebirds, which are seeing a group of shorebirds over here in this image on the left-hand side. And the other group that we're going to be talking about are gulls, something I'm sure you all are very familiar with. Pretty much anywhere on the Cape, whether that be a parking lot or a beach or McDonald's. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to start off by sharing some information with you about shorebirds. So first of all, what exactly is a shorebird? They are a really fascinating, diverse group of birds with a lot of interesting adaptations. So I'll be talking about both some of the things that make them unique from other types of birds and some of those adaptations. And additionally, I will be talking about how to identify a number of the common shorebirds that we see.
Ruddy Turnstones, piping plover.
You could just turn off your mic for me there. I hear somebody knows what a ruddy turnstone is. That's very exciting because that's one of my favorite shorebirds. So if you take a look at this image at the bottom of your screen, this gives you a sense of some of the diversity of shorebirds. They come in all different shapes, all different sizes. Some have short bills, some have long bills. Some of them nest here, some of them nest in the Arctic. So there's a lot of diversity represented in this group. In general, most shorebirds are ground nesters. So some of them literally just plop their eggs right down on the ground. Others will put a little bit more effort into the process by actually kind of excavating little holes or even providing some lining and camouflaging their nests. But they don't put a lot of effort into nest building like a lot of our backyard birds that you may be familiar with. Many of these birds breed in the Arctic. So when we see them in spring and fall, which is when we see the largest numbers of shorebirds on the Cape, we really are seeing them during migration. There are some that breed here that I will talk about, but most of the shorebirds we see are just using us as a stopover point en route to points further north where they will actually be engaging in their breeding and nesting behavior. For most shorebirds, the male and female look very similar. In a lot of species, you really can't even tell them apart. Even an expert birder couldn't tell them apart. They are long distance migrants. Some species of shorebirds will travel as much as 15 to 20,000 miles in a year between overwintering grounds and nesting grounds. And as a result of that, they're really strong flyers. Their bodies have evolved over time to have really, really strong muscles propelling their wings. And as a result, they're able to engage in really long distance nonstop flights. In fact, one species called the Hudsonian Godwit, which I'll show you a picture of, has actually been recorded traveling 8,000 miles nonstop. So that's just absolutely mind-blowing to think about. So this group of birds are called shorebirds. However, they aren't only found on the shore. There are species of shorebirds such as the killdeer, which actually nests in fields. So it can be a misleading term, as you know, you're not only going to find them right on the beach or close to water. And if we were in Great Britain, this group of birds is instead referred to as waders, which can get a little bit confusing because here in North America, ornithologists refer to waders as our herons and egrets. So a little bit different, but just know if you have any bird guides produced in Great Britain, of which there are a lot, they're going to be referring to this group as waders instead. So the shorebirds that we see on Cape Cod, most of them can be divided into two groups, the plovers and the sandpipers. So On the left-hand side of your screen here is an example of a plover, and this is a species you probably are familiar with, probably our most famous shorebird on Cape Cod, the piping plover. And take a look at this bird as compared to the sandpiper on the right-hand side. Plovers tend to have shorter bills than sandpipers. They tend to stand in a more upright posture, and they also have larger eyes. Sandpipers, often you will see kind of with their back parallel to wherever they're feeding, and they are usually a bit lower to the ground with a longer bill. And these two groups of birds, as you may guess by looking at the differences in shape, also feed differently. So this piping plover on the left-hand side is feeding by picking little invertebrates off of the surface of the sand. It runs along the beach and stands upright and uses those large eyes and good eyesight to actually visually look for prey, which it picks off of the ground with that little stubby bill. For most sandpipers, they're actually relying on their bill to find their food. So they're probing animals. They will probe in the mud. Their bills actually are able to feel movement from invertebrates, tiny worms and other creatures in the mud, and they use their bill as more a form of sight than their eyes in that way. So different groups of shorebirds and different methods of foraging. And a little bit more about shorebird feeding behavior. They engage in something that's called resource partitioning. So the plovers I mentioned are mostly picking their food right off of this surface, as you can see by this bird second from the left, or second from the right in this image. That's an example of a plover that would be picking things right up off the ground. And with sandpipers, you'll notice as we look at different species, their bills are often shaped differently and of different lengths. So one shorebird may be picking something that's just a quarter of an inch under the mud, whereas another that has a longer bill is going to be getting something a couple inches under the mud. Another may have a curved bill that it uses to go into fiddler crab burrows and things like that. So this difference in bills allows them to partition resources, meaning that there can be hundreds of shorebirds all in the exact same feeding location, and they're not going to be competing with each other. They're all going to be foraging at slightly different levels and on different food sources. So it's really a remarkable adaptation. Another adaptation that shorebirds have is called counter shading. So if you take a look at this picture, this is a flock of Sanderlings. You'll notice that they're very light underneath and dark on top. And this is seen in pretty much any species of shorebird. And the reason for that is if you're a predator, particularly a bird of prey, looking to feed on a shorebird, if you're flying above a shorebird that's foraging on a sandy or muddy flat, they're going to blend in from above. And the opposite is true. When they're in flight, if you are a predator looking up at them, that light underbelly is going to blend right into the sky. So it's really a remarkable adaptation for camouflage. I mentioned a little bit about shorebird nests. There's a variety of nests. They're all ground nesters. On the left here, this image laid directly on the sand, few shells around it to kind of help it blend in, but really it's not a very formal nest. And this could be a nest from something like a piping plover. They nest directly on the sand like that in just a little scrape, nothing too fancy. Over here on the right, we're seeing an example of a sandpiper that nests way up in the Arctic. And they often will just sit right down and lay their eggs amongst whatever ground vegetation is there. All right, Now we're going to get into actually identifying some of these birds. And I've chosen the most common shorebirds that you are likely to encounter if you spend any time in spring and fall walking on our beaches. The first of which is the black-bellied plover. And this is a bird that we'll start to see showing up as a migrant in April, so relatively soon. They've been overwintering in the northern parts of South America, Brazil, into Central America, and they start passing through our area and stopping here to feed, typically in April and May. And then we'll see them again at the end of the summer, July, August, and September, after breeding activities are done. So on the left-hand side, we have an adult black-bellied plover. The males and females look exactly the same. That's an adult in full breeding plumage. And notice that you can obviously see where that name black-bellied plover comes from. They have black all along from the face all the way underneath their belly and a beautiful scaly back. They're a really distinctive bird. They have that upright posture and that big eye because they're running around looking for food. On the right-hand side, you can see a young or non-breeding plumage black-bellied plover, and they look very different. None of that black belly, still the same shape bill and the same body shape, but they lose that black belly, so it's more difficult to identify them. Now, here's a bird that I've already mentioned that I know many of you are familiar with, our piping plover. And that scientific name, Charadrius melodus, the melodus as in melody, comes from their piping call. And they have a high-pitched piping call that they'll make when predators are nearby or when somebody has disturbed them, and that's where their name comes from. If you take a look, we have an adult here on the left. The males and females are very hard to tell apart, although shorebird biologists that work with them and monitor are able to tell them apart. The males have a slightly more extensive ring around the neck and a little bit more black on the forehead than the females. There's a young bird. So on the right-hand side, we're looking at both a chick on the top, and they are one of the cutest birds out there. They're absolutely adorable. They look just like a couple of cotton balls stuck on toothpicks, if you've ever been lucky enough to see them on our beaches here on the Cape. And this bird is probably only a couple days old. Piping plovers, their chicks are referred to as precocial, as most shorebird chicks are. And that comes from the word precocious. Within a couple hours of them hatching, they're able to get up and feed themselves and forage and really they're covered in down right at birth, not like if you think of, a robin that nests in your backyard. When those chicks hatch out, they're completely naked and helpless. Piping plovers are hatched out on the ground, so they really need to be able to move and feed themselves very quickly in order to survive. Below the chick is an example of what a piping plover looks like once it has grown up its first summer. So this chick by the end of the first summer will look like that. And that's also very similar to what they look like when they're in non-breeding plumage in the winter months. A couple more notes about piping plovers. One of the reasons why they can be a bit of a controversial bird on the Cape is that often off-road vehicle areas on beaches are closed when they have chicks. And I included this image here of a piping plover running through tire tracks because I think it's pretty powerful. I've also seen pictures of piping plover chicks actually hunkered down in tire tracks, using it as a spot to kind of be camouflaged and protected. So they do really actually get run over fairly regularly if chicks are present when vehicles are present. Hence the reason that when the chicks are not able to fly, those areas are closed. Another interesting adaptation of piping plovers, if you look over on the right-hand side here, you'll see this bird almost looks like it's in distress. And this piping plover is actually doing what's called a broken wing display. So this bird is pretending that it has a broken wing. And chances are it has either a nest or some chicks nearby, and it's doing its best to get a person or a predator to head away from its nest. So it pretends to have a broken wing and runs off in the opposite direction of where its young are in hopes that the predator will follow it and get away from the young. And then when the predator approaches, all of a sudden, oh, it's totally fine and it takes off. All right. Another kind of plover that we see as a migrant here is called the Semi-Palmated Plover. And this word semi-palmated means partially webbed. So semi-palmated plovers have partially webbed feet, which is very helpful because they often forage on mud flats. So having, think of it kind of like snowshoes. It helps prevent them from sinking into really muddy, soft areas. If you notice, this plover on the left is an adult in breeding plumage. It has a dark ring around the neck. The one on the right is in non-breeding plumage. It's got a paler bill and a brown ring around the neck. They don't nest here. They nest up in the Arctic, but we do see them in large numbers in spring and fall during migration. And you may have noticed that they are quite a bit darker in color than our piping plover, much browner as opposed to gray, which makes sense because piping plovers live on the beach where they blend in better as a gray bird, and semi-palmated plovers prefer muddy areas where they blend in much better with brown plumage. American oyster catcher is another example of a shorebird species that nests here on Cape Cod. And if you see an American oyster catcher, you're going to remember it and you're going to wonder what the heck that bird is, because they're very large and very distinctive. They have that bright orange bill, that bright colored eye, and they're really beautiful. They're called oyster catchers because they do eat shellfish. They either will pick up a shellfish with that giant bill and bash it against a rock to open it up, or they will try and find oysters and other shellfish that are cracked open just a little bit, and that very large, powerful bill of theirs can actually pry that right open so they can get inside at the food. American oyster catchers also nest right on the beaches. They do nest on the Cape. They don't have a ton of success here. It's not very often that we have American oyster catcher chicks that survive to adulthood. A lot of issues with predation in this species with their nests. On the right-hand side, that is an example of a young oyster catcher. That bird probably, if it hatched out in the spring, this is what it would look like by the end of the summer. And you'll notice it's got a bit of a scaly back. Its bill is a little shorter and colored differently. And it also doesn't develop that, that bright yellow eye until its second year of life. Greater yellow legs. This bird is one species that the name really makes sense. Take a look at that bird. Those are some bright yellow legs. So I should also mention that greater yellow legs are an example of a sandpiper. So I talked about plovers versus sandpipers. We're now going to be talking about sandpipers. And you'll notice that compared to the plovers we saw, the sandpipers will have much longer bills because they're using them to actually forage in the mud. Greater yellow legs, they don't nest here but pass through during migration. They have a fairly long bill. If you really want to get into the nitty gritty, their bill is about twice the length of their head, as opposed to the next bird I'm going to show you here, the lesser yellow legs. So lesser and greater yellow legs, I'm going to go back to the greater here. You take a look at them, you're going to say, okay, that looks exactly like the same bird. But it's actually, looking at the bill is a good way to tell them apart. The lesser yellow legs has a bill that's about 1.5 times the length of the head, as opposed to the greater yellow legs that has a bill that's twice the length of the head. And also their calls are different. The greater yellow legs has a greater call. They make more noise. They're very loud, actually. You can hear them in the marshes and on the Cape late summer and early fall, and they go toot 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 toot. They're very loud. Chances are you've heard them before, whether you realized it or not. The lesser yellow legs has the lesser call of the two. They just go toot toot. So just like the greater has the greater call, the lesser has the lesser call. And also the size difference between them is what you might expect. The greater is larger and the lesser is smaller. All right, the willet. This is a really awesome shorebird and a good example of kind of a success story. They have been protected more in recent years in their nesting activities, and they are doing pretty well. There's barely a beach you can go to around here in the summertime without hearing whip with it, whip with it, whip with it. They're very loud. They're a fairly large shorebird, and they can be easy to identify because they have this really distinctive white stripe right through the middle of the wing. So if you see a bird flying around screaming at you, going whip with it, whip with it, whip with it, with that white stripe, chances are you found a willet. They do nest on the edge of salt marshes. So they sometimes will lose their nests to storms and particularly high tides. So they need to learn the site where they're nesting and the tides there to ensure that they're laying their eggs high enough above the high tide line. This is a species that we do have nest regularly at Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. So if you're interested in seeing what you're looking at here, this adorable little baby willet, come visit us in the summer months. They nest in July and typically have young by August. Another spectacular shorebird that's an easy one to identify is called the Wimbrel. This is another species that we have regularly at Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary, and they really like fiddler crabs. So anywhere that you go, if you see a lot of fiddler crabs, when it comes to the months of July, August, and early September, keep an eye out for Wimbrel. Wimbrel don't nest here, but they do pass through here in the second half of July and August into September. And they have that nice long curved bill, which is really distinctive. They're in the same genus as curlews. And if you're at all familiar with curlews have just these crazy long curved bills. But the Wimbrel bill is specially adapted to be able to follow the curve of a fiddler crab burrow. So they're really specialized fiddler crab and eaters. And that's why we see them often at Wellfleet Bay, because we have a large population of them there. Another group of shorebirds that has, excuse me, very long bills are the godwits. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that a bird called the Hudsonian Godwit has been recorded flying 8,000 miles nonstop. This is a Hudsonian Godwit on the left-hand side, the darker of the two Godwits. Another species called the bar-tail Godwit, which is very rare on Cape Cod, so I did not include a picture here, actually has one of the longest migrations of any bird recorded in the world at over 20,000 miles. So they're remarkable flyers and very long distance migrants. The other Godwit that I have pictured here is called a marbled Godwit, and if you look at its back, it kind of has a marbled appearance to it, hence the name. And these are distinctive birds, very long, slightly upcurved bills. Also not nesting here on the Cape, but something that we see passing through during migration. And here's another picture of a marbled godwit displaying what's called rhinokinesis. And this is a really awesome adaptation that many shorebirds display. So not only are shorebird bills capable of feeling the movements of invertebrates underground, they're also able to open them and close them with kind of, their bills are almost separated into kind of separate sections with separate muscle groups. And that allows them to open up, you know, just the tip of the bill, as you're seeing in this example here. So it is a really flexible bill that's well controlled with muscles. It's pretty remarkable. Okay, Ruddy Turnstone is probably my favorite shorebird. I mean, they're absolutely beautiful. If you see this bird, it's so striking, you're not going to forget it. What we're looking at here on the left is a Ruddy Turnstone in full breeding plumage. And they just have this really kind of almost harlequin-like pattern of black and white with that lovely ruddy, hence the name, ruddy rusty red color mixed in on the back. And on the right-hand side is an example of a Ruddy Turnstone that's in non-breeding plumage. So breeding plumage on the left, that's what we'd see in the spring and early fall. And we do actually see them here overwintering. So anywhere that's rocky, like jetties in particular, you can see ruddy turnstones foraging there in the winter months. But they get that name ruddy turnstone because they prefer rocky habitats and they have a really awesome method of foraging. Particularly this picture here on the left is just really striking. They do actually turn over stones, hence the name. They pick up rocks. This one on the left is picking up a particularly large rock for an individual that size and flip them over in order to find little invertebrates hiding underneath. So another example of resource partitioning. Those other shorebird species aren't accessing invertebrates under rocks, so they've found their own little niche to fill. Now we're going to get into a group of sandpipers that are called the peep sandpipers. And these are the bane of many birders' existences. And you will understand why as I go through. There's a number of these small shorebirds that look very, very similar. So you can always just say, hey, there's a sandpiper. And that's, that's a good identification. But if you really want to get into it, there are some things you can look for to tell these very similar species apart. So the semi-palmated sandpiper, earlier we saw the semi-palmated plover. So we know that semi-palmated means partially webbed, and semi-palmated sandpipers do also have partially webbed feet, hence the name. And they're a small shorebird with a slightly curved dark beak, which is pretty long for its body size. And they have dark grayish brown colored legs. Now, take a look at our next species here, the least sandpiper, which at first glance, you're going to say, oh, those look like the same bird. But take a look. Least sandpiper is actually the smallest sandpiper in the world. They're very small. So if they're in a mixed flock, you can say, oh, okay, those really tiny ones are going to be the least sandpipers. And also least have light legs. So if you take a look, they have those yellow legs as opposed to those dark colored legs on our semi-palmated sandpiper. And also they have a bit more of a scaly kind of gray appearance to their back. Really cute little birds. And another one of our peep sandpipers is the Sanderling. And this is a bird, if you like to walk on the beach in the winter months, you have most definitely seen Sanderlings. They are a shorebird species that overwinters on the Cape. So they breed up in the Arctic. And for them, this is a nice place to spend the winter. And you'll notice that in breeding plumage, they have this really beautiful rusty red color and kind of mixed in with black on the back. And in non-breeding plumage, like in the winter, when we are seeing them on our beaches, they are really light colored. And their scientific name, Calidris alba, alba meaning white. And that's because they are, of any of the shorebirds we see here, they're the lightest, most the whitest in appearance. And they're also referred to as wave chasers. And that's because they will run in as soon as a wave recedes and pick up whatever little creatures have been left behind. And then they'll run back up again before the next wave comes in. So it does look like they're chasing the waves up and down the beach. And they often hang out in flocks while they're doing that. The red knot is a really striking, fairly large shorebird, and they're very chunky. If you take a look at this red knot on the left, that's in breeding plumage. That beautiful salmony red is where the red in their name comes from. But they're a very chunky, kind of rotund shorebird, and their body shape is pretty significantly different from some of the smaller sandpipers that they often will be feeding next to. And in their non-breeding plumage, they lose that red, but they still have that kind of rotund appearance to them. And they have a really interesting migratory story associated with them. This image that I'm showing is a picture of Delaware Bay, and it is an extremely important stopover point for red knots during their migration. It's estimated that 50 to 80% of the entire population of subspecies of red knots called the Rufa red knot depends on Delaware Bay as a stopover point. And the reason that they're stopping over there, along with a lot of other shorebirds, is because of the huge population of horseshoe crabs. So you can also see in the foreground of this picture, you can pick up the shell shape of some horseshoe crabs sticking out of the water there. And they time their migration specifically to correspond with horseshoe crabs spawning. So they arrive at Delaware Bay when the horseshoe crabs are spawning, and they feast on horseshoe crab eggs. And the roofer red knots have actually declined very significantly over the past 15 to 20 years, mostly because of a significant decline in horseshoe crab populations in Delaware Bay. So they arrive at these feeding grounds and they need to be able to gain a certain amount of weight, because then they're going to be flying from there right to the Arctic. And if there aren't enough horseshoe crabs, they're breeding, producing eggs, they don't have enough food for them to gain enough weight, and they don't survive the rest of their migration. So they actually seem to have leveled off and maybe be rebounding a bit as the horseshoe crab population in Delaware Bay is being protected and has started to increase. So we're hopeful that we're going to see them increase as well. Dunlin is another example of a shorebird that we see on the beaches here in the winter. They do also pass through during migration, but we have some that will hang out on our beaches, often with sanderlings. Another light colored bird. What they look like when they're on our beaches in the winter is what you're seeing here on the right. They have a long bill, which is pretty distinctive. In breeding plumage, they have a really interesting black belly patch that you can see in the image on the left, and they're pretty bright red on the back for a shorebird. Short-billed dowitcher. This is kind of a funny one to me, because you look at that and you think, why would anyone name that short-billed anything? Short-billed dowitcher only has a short bill when you're comparing it to the very similar long-billed dowitcher. So the long-billed dowitcher has a slightly longer bill, and typically that is a species that migrates through the middle of our country. So we don't typically see long-billed dowitchers here, but short-billed dowitchers are very common in spring and fall migration, and they are nicknamed sewing machine birds. So they take that very long bill of theirs and use it almost like the needle of a sewing machine, weaving in and out across the mud flats and sand flats that they're foraging on, and they're pulling out invertebrates as they go. Okay, so I was going to pause here before I start talking about gulls to see if anybody has asked any questions. Are you seeing anything in the chat, Sue?
I've actually seen one, and probably prompted by your talk about plovers. Someone wanted to know about the proper pronunciation, because probably like me, they probably thought it was plover, which I've always thought.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I actually caught myself during my presentation. I don't know if everybody else caught this, but I said plover and I said plover. I said both. And either one, I mean, it's tomato, tomato. I hear birders say plover. I hear birders say plover. So whatever you want to say it.
Okay. I didn't see anything at the moment, but I guess you can keep going, because, you know, I'm sure people might think of stuff after you start again, and we will get them next time.
Yes, that
sounds
good. Okay. All right. So now we've talked about the shorebirds that are common visitors and nesters on Cape Cod. Now we're going to get into an even more ubiquitous group, the gulls. And we'll talk a bit about what makes a gull and what makes them different from other groups of birds. And we're also going to talk just a little bit about different plumages and how to tell the age of gulls. If you go sit at a parking lot at your favorite beach, you're going to see a whole variety of colors and different plumages of gulls. So I'll get a little bit into what those mean. And then I will talk about the most common gulls found on Cape Cod, so you can impress everybody the next time you go to McDonald's parking lot with your knowledge of gull identification. And if you take a look at this picture here, this is really a beautiful gull. You don't often think of gulls as being beautiful, but this is a laughing gull, and they'll be starting to come back to Cape Cod in large numbers over the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for them, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. So first of all, what is a gull? Gulls are part of two different genuses or genera, Laris and Rissa. And Laris includes the most gulls. It's divided into two groups, which are the two groups I'll be talking about today, hooded gulls and white-headed gulls. And it's pretty obvious where those names come from, as you'll find out. They are opportunistic omnivores, or also you could also call them scavengers. So this means that they will eat anything edible they can find, whether that be a crab or a shellfish on the beach, or a, old sandwich out of a trash can. So they're highly adaptable to living with humans. So in an era when many groups of birds have seen significant declines, most species of gulls have done fairly well. Similar to crows, they're another example of a species that has adapted very well to living with humans and has increased in numbers as a result. And gulls are fairly long-lived. In the wild, they can live 10 to 15 years on average. That is pretty typical for most birds. Once they get through the first year of life, that's when most birds will die. Only about half birds will make it through their first year of life. And once they get through that, they have another 10 or 15 years to go. But they don't breed until they're 3 to 5 years old. Now, I won't read this. I'll let you guys all read this quote to yourselves. But if anyone's familiar with David Allen Sibley, he's kind of the bird guide guru. He is a local Massachusetts guy and a very talented artist who has made some phenomenal bird guides. And he basically is just saying that identifying gulls is extremely difficult. And if you really want to get into it, it's going to take some time and some methodical study. Otherwise, you're not going to really be able to successfully identify gulls. And there have been a total of 18 different species which have been viewed on Cape Cod. If you go just to the beach on a typical day, you're probably only going to see 3 or 4 of them, but there actually are a diversity that have occurred here. And this gull that is shown here in this image is an example of a hooded gull, like the laughing gull we saw before, any gull that has a black hood. And this is a Bonaparte's gull, which is an oceanic gull, a small oceanic gull that we see in spring and fall migrations. So I'm not going to get too much into the nitty gritty of plumages and aging, but just it suffices to say that there are a lot of different plumages that gulls can go through, which is why you see so much variety just looking at one flock of gulls in their appearance. And they can go through 8 or even more different appearances or different plumages before they become adults. And when I have here 2, 3, and 4-year gulls, that means there are some gulls it takes 2 years before they look like an adult, and others it can take as much as 4 years before they look like an adult. And there's also a lot of differences just in individual wear to feathers. And in the pictures that I show here on the right, those are 2 ring-billed gulls hanging out together in a parking lot, which is a common thing to see. And the one on the top has had a lot more abrasion to its feathers. So if you notice there, it almost looks white on the side, whereas on the other gull, it looks much more brown. So the gull on the top, a lot of the tips of its feathers have worn off because it hasn't molted into new feathers for a long time. Whereas the gull on the bottom probably molted more recently, and that brown has not yet worn off its feathers. So over time, changes in feathers from molting and wear can make birds look very different, even if they're the same species and the same age. And this is the last thing I'm going to show you about how complicated plumages in gulls are. In this example, from when this is a herring gull shown here, from when that bird hatches to when it finally gets to be a full adult, like you see at the bottom and like you probably recognize from the beach, it goes through 9 different plumages. So it can be really difficult to learn all of the different ways that a single species of gull can look. So now I will talk a little bit more about the most common species of gulls that we have on Cape Cod. and how you can identify them. This is the laughing gull, which I showed at the beginning, and they are seen here year round, although there's only very small numbers of them here in the winter months. In the summer, they are very abundant, and they get that name laughing gull because they go, ah, ha, 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 ha. So I'm sure you've all heard that at some point on Cape Cod. They're very loud. They sound like they're laughing. You're not going to miss them if they're around. And they are an example of a hooded gull. So you see, it looks like it's wearing that black hood. It also has some really striking crescents of white above and below the eye, which are a pretty distinctive identification feature, and a bright red bill. So they really are an attractive bird. They nest on Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, so off the coast to the south of Chatham. So you can be lucky enough to see young laughing gulls in the fall after breeding season. This is what a young laughing gull looks like. Very scaly, very brown, much different from what the full adult looks like. But often I've seen them on the beaches close to Monomoy, you know, Chatham, Harwich area and the Sound beaches in the fall, and they are even louder than their parents. They just beg and beg and beg. So if you see a smallish gull just making all sorts of racket in the late summer and early fall, chasing around an adult gull, it's very likely that it is a young laughing gull that's left the nest but is still looking to get some food from its parents. And I also wanted to show this bird on the right is what a laughing gull looks like in the winter months. So it looks like it's a completely different species, but this is just the difference between their summer plumage and their winter plumage. And it almost completely loses that black hood in the winter, except for a little bit of a wash of gray across the front and the back of the head. So a lot of variation. Okay. Ringbill gull. This is the most common parking lot gull in general. And they get that name ring-billed gull because they do have a black ring around the end of their bill, fairly light gray on the back. On the left-hand side is what a ring-bill gull looks like in its full breeding plumage, and on the right is in the wintertime in non-breeding plumage. So really not a significant difference. The only thing that's really apparent is the crisp white head becomes more of a mottled gray head. But other than that, they look pretty identical between the spring, or excuse me, between the summer and the winter. And they are experts at foraging for trash. So you'll see them on roadsides and parking lots, and they take that scavenger name to heart and really scavenge for pretty much anything they can find. And here's an example of a ringbill gull in flight. You'll notice the wingtips almost look like they've been dipped in ink, that really black wingtip, but also has kind of a circle of white in the very tip in the first and second primary feathers there. Herring gull. Herring gull does not have a ring around the bill, so that's something that you can look for to help differentiate it from a ringbill gull. And they also are much larger than a ringbill gull. Herring gulls have about a 5.5-foot wingspan, so they're huge. They have pink colored legs, slaty gray back. The one on the left here is our breeding plumage summer herring gull, and the one on the right is in the winter with that more mottled brown head. But they are extremely common on the beaches on the Cape. You can see them in parking lots too, but they tend to kind of stick to beaches and marshes mostly. Now, another species, the lesser blackback gull, is not quite as common as our herring gull. There are a few of them that are seen pretty reliably though. And they are actually a European species of gull that's just starting to become more of a regular fixture in Eastern North America. And notice that they have pretty bright yellow legs. That's a good thing to look for in identifying gulls. Look at the leg color. So on our lesser blackback, we have those bright yellow legs. The herring gull has pinkish gray, kind of dull colored legs. And the lesser blackback gull is a bit darker in color than our herring gull, but not as dark as the great black-backed gull. And take a look, great black-backed gull has pink legs as opposed to the bright yellow legs on that lesser black-backed gull. Great black-backed gulls are really a fascinating species. It's so easy to take gulls for granted living somewhere like Cape Cod, where you have them flying all over your house and parking lots and beaches. They're pretty much everywhere. But once you get to know them a little bit more, they're actually a really fascinating group. The great black-backed gull is actually the largest species of gull on Earth, and it has over a 6-foot wingspan. It's, as you can see, a very dark colored bird, which is where the great black-backed gull name comes from. And they can actually be pretty fierce predators. I once observed a peregrine falcon kill a small duck called a green-winged teal, and a great black-backed gull came over and just ripped that green-winged teal right away from the falcon, and the falcon didn't even fight back. It took off. And great black-backed gulls are also a significant source of predation for a lot of our local nesting shorebird species. They will eat the eggs and young of piping plovers, terns, oyster catchers. So they are definitely a predator that folks who are managing those shorebird species have to keep an eye out. And they're also extremely intelligent. So that's another thing that they are able to key in on nests and young, and they're able to remember locations as well. If you take a look, full breeding plumage individual is shown here on the left. And if you go over to the right-hand side, you'll see another full breeding plumage one. With great black-backed gulls, it actually takes them 4 full years to get to look like an adult. So the individual on the right-hand side of the right photo would be probably a 3rd-year gull. You notice it's like still got some scaly feathers to it, doesn't have that crisp coloration. It needs 1 more year before it will molt into those really crisp colors. All right, well, let's see, that's all I've got to say about gulls. I will share with you a couple resources here if any of you have had your interest sparked in learning more about shorebirds and gulls. It's a great time of year to get into it. April and May, we start seeing numbers of shorebirds ramp up, and we also will start to have some more species of gulls, like our laughing gulls will return in large numbers. So now's the time to start going out and looking for these birds. And if you're looking for more opportunities to learn about them, Allaboutbirds.org is one of my favorite websites to recommend. That's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's a really wonderful, free, accessible resource that has profiles of all of the birds in North America and really breaks all the information down very well. If you want to get into some real details, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has the Handbook of Bird Biology that they've produced that's available online that gets into all of the nitty-gritty about bird adaptations and natural history. There is a specific Gulls of North America book that's put out by Peterson Field Guides that will show you some of all those crazy plumages I was talking about. It'll show you, 15 different pictures showing all the different plumages for herring gulls. And if you really want to get into it, that's a good resource. I mentioned David Allen Sibley and his wonderful bird guides. That's my go-to field guide for everything, is the Sibley Guide to Birds. And finally, Mass Audubon is available as a resource. So I also, you'll see in a moment, I've included my contact information at the end of the presentation. I love to get pictures of birds and, recordings of bird songs and things like that. So if you have questions about anything, don't be afraid to shoot me an email or call one of our wildlife sanctuaries, and we can get you in touch with the right Mass Audubon member to answer your questions. And so thank you very much for the opportunity, Sue. I'm happy to take any other questions if we've had any come in.
Oh, there we definitely have. I think the gulls definitely sparked a lot of attention.
Good, I'm glad.
Yeah, we've got a handful, so I'm going to go in order. One person said, a beach near where we go boating has a 1-legged gull we see each summer. How long can they live?
Well, that's a good question. um, if you've gotten to see it several summers and it's, still alive, then it's probably has adapted very well to living with one leg. And if it's still alive and healthy, I don't see any reason why it couldn't live the full 10 to 15 years of another gull if it's already made it this long and adapted to living with it. That's an interesting story.
Yeah, okay. And this is a good question. Are the birds which dive bomb us occasionally on our walks on the beach the piping plovers?
That's a great question. And that's actually, those would be terns. And that's a whole nother group of birds on the beach that I just didn't have time to fit everything in. But there are on the Cape, we have nesting least terns and common terns and roseate terns. And they nest in colonies of several birds. And if you get close to those colonies, they'll start dive bombing you, trying to get you to go away.
Okay, and is there a protective evolutionary reason for the plumage changes?
Oh, that's a good question. Generally, when we refer to breeding plumage, that's kind of used as a way to advertise breeding availability. A lot of birds, it will take several years before they actually acquire their breeding plumage because it takes them several years before they're ready to breed. So in general, it's a more attractive, brighter colored plumage that's used to signal availability for breeding.
Oh, wow. Okay, and one person had a comment. I saw a great black-backed gull grab a pigeon, whack it dead, and take it away to eat. My goodness.
Wow. That's really awesome. Yeah. Of course I say that's awesome. But yeah, black-backed gulls, they're really fearsome predators. It's pretty regular to see them doing things like that. They actually will drown birds as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and I love cormorants. So they considered shorebirds?
Yeah, cormorants are definitely beach birds. They're more closely related to boobies, like blue-footed boobies and anhingas, if you've ever been down to Florida and seen anhingas before. So they're not very closely related to the group of shorebirds I was talking about, but they certainly use the same habitats.
Okay, and someone was asking, are most of these shorebirds seen in the Upper Cape also, or more in the Lower Cape?
That's a good question. Really, anywhere where there are tidal flats available, you'll be able to see shorebirds. So I'm trying to think of some particularly good areas. I know, I do a lot more birding on the Outer Cape. Places like Nauset Marsh on the Outer Cape at low tide can attract huge numbers of birds. And Brewster, the flats at low tide, but anywhere where you can find an area that's exposed at low tide for these birds to feed, they're going to use for feeding during migration.
Yeah, someone pointed out that there's a lot of gulls at Surf Drive Beach, which is very close to the library here.
Good. Well, then everybody should go down there and go study their gulls after this.
Yeah. Okay, and someone has said, I have grown concerned with dogs on the beach. Are they problematic to shorebirds, to their environment, like wrecking fiddler crab holes or digging holes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can certainly speak a bit to the shorebird piece of that. I know everywhere that Mass Audubon manages shorebirds, and I know this is true for the towns who manage the shorebirds themselves, and for Cape Cod National Seashore, they also manage shorebirds. We do have closures for dogs during shorebird nesting and migration because they do stress the birds out. Like, for example, I showed that picture of the piping plover doing the broken wing display. If it saw a dog on the beach, it would start doing that broken wing display. It really freaks them out because coyotes and foxes are two of the main predators for a lot of these shorebirds. So seeing a dog puts them into high alert and certainly does scare them and distract them from their activities of minding their nests and taking care of their young. So I think, most beaches, I know in my part of the Cape, I don't know about yours, but I know all the beaches around me are closed to dogs in the summer months. Usually it varies a bit, but from May through October around those times, which is when we have the bulk of our shorebirds here. So I think that's a good thing. And then I also just think, enforcing keeping dogs on leashes when wildlife is around and that type of thing can be helpful too.
Yeah.
I think the other piece about, as far as digging up the ground, I wouldn't think there would be enough of that for it to really have a significant impact, but another thing to think about.
Okay, we have a few more. Can you describe the training you have had to be such a good bird expert?
Oh, well, thank you. So a lot of my background is really just been learning in the field. I grew up in a family of nature people, and my dad actually worked for Audubon as a bird guide in the 60s and 70s, so I kind of come by it naturally. And I did do an ornithology class with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but beyond that it's all been in the field with other birders.
Great. Okay, and how well do these birds coexist together, these shorebirds?
Shorebirds in general coexist very well. So the resource partitioning that I talked about helps to eliminate a lot of competition. So there can be thousands of shorebirds foraging together without having, all of them having their own food resources. So they don't really have much of an incentive to have any type of conflict between them. So I'd say they coexist very well. Gulls, I would not say coexist as well as the shorebirds do. I'm sure you've all, if you drop some French fries out, not that I would recommend dropping French fries outside of your vehicle in a parking lot, but if you were to do that, you would see gulls get pretty aggressive with one another fighting over food resources. So they don't coexist quite as peacefully as the shorebirds.
Okay, yeah, I've noticed that. Okay, and someone said if they see a bird injured by fishing wire or a hook, who could they contact, particularly around here, I guess?
Good question. Yeah. So there is, closer to you guys, the Cape Wildlife Center, which is based in Barnstable, would probably be the closest place to contact for your part of the Cape. I know closer to us, we have another facility in Eastham called Wild Care, which also deals with injured birds as well. So you could contact either of those organizations, and they work with each other closely as well. Those would be your best bets.
Okay, we've got a handful more. Let us know if you run out of time because of
no, I'm happy to answer.
Okay, good. Do we get cliff swallows around here, nesting in the banks of dunes, ?
So good question. The swallows that we see nesting in the banks of dunes are actually called bank swallows. And cliff swallows, there is also a cliff swallow that exists, and we occasionally will see cliff swallows as kind of an unusual migrant passing through here, but it's a pretty unusual sighting for the Cape. But bank swallows in the right habitat, particularly areas where there's some exposed coastal bluffs, they will form small colonies. They excavate little burrows in those cliffs where they have their nests, and they're really fun to watch. So those are bank swallows.
Wow. Okay. And do gulls still breed on the Wee Pecket Island?
I don't know, because I don't know where that is.
I don't either. Okay. And I live on the Mid Cape myself, and thank you so much. Great topic. Let me see what else there is. And she asked for you to put up the resource slide again.
Oh, I'd be happy to.
Yep. And another thank you. And someone requested the PowerPoint. If you feel like passing it along to me, I can pass it along to the group.
To you, or I know you're recording it too, if you wanted to.
Yes, and just to let everyone know, I am recording it, and just to make it easier, I'm going to send another email out to the whole group with the link. With the link once I get it up. What I'm going to do is upload it to our YouTube page and put it up there, and then I'll probably link to it on our Facebook too in Twitter once we get that up. And let me see if there's any more questions. We have a few more thank yous, and they mentioned how knowledgeable you are. And I guess that is it for the moment. I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I wanted to also thank the trustees of the Falmouth Public Library who sponsored many of our programs. I want to thank Mass Audubon for doing these wonderful programs and all the things that you do. And again, we are going to try to get you guys back on a regular basis, especially, there's certain topics for certain seasons that I'm sure will interest folks as well. So that is that. And again, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming.
Glad so many people came.
Yeah, me too. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.